Thanks for being here. The interesting thing as we look at edge and cloud is we're not talking about anything except where the computer sits, right? It's just somebody else's computer that we're talking about doing our computation on, and how we can securely get the workloads to that, whether it's within the fence line or within somebody else's highly secure data center. And it's all just a matter of where we're placing our workloads, what latency we can live with, and the security we wrap around the computer.
Yeah, thanks. I would say as we've gone through a couple of different meetings already today, I'd say obviously we start with what's the risk, right? What's the risk we're willing to live with, right? What's the requirements that the business needs, and what's the value it's going to generate as we look at these two components. There's a lot of use cases for edge that you can deploy out there that may not impact your overall risk as much as, say, going and moving to cloud, depending on where you want to put that in your environment. So it'll be interesting to see what everybody's kind of perspective is on this, besides, you know, our kind of answers to the kind of the canned questions that Eric gave us earlier. But I'm just interested to see kind of the feedback and the Q&A here. So.
Yeah, when I come at technologies like IIoT, and when you have conversations with folks, you start to realize that it's a new name for something you've probably been doing some way or another for a very long time, right? If you look at traditional PLC or DCS type architectures, I mean, let's face it, you've got computers, they're sitting on the edge, they're doing their own processing, they're independent, collaboratively networked with their adjacent neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. It's just as the point was made in the beginning here, it's just that the location is different, right? And so when it comes to cybersecurity, we've depended for a long time on our, you know, Purdue model or layers of defense or whatever kind of architecture you have in place to get a level of security sense from the depth, right? Like it's many layers down to get there. When it comes to IIoT, you've removed a lot of those. So the edge now is, you know, I won't say scary, it's becoming a lot less scary all the time, but you are much more exposed.
All right, so I have a couple of questions to dig in a little bit on some of the things that you've mentioned, each of you have mentioned. So imagine for a moment I'm an automation engineer, which I was not, but we'll imagine for a moment that I am an automation engineer. I am a chemical engineer, but I've never really practiced automation. And I've come through the transition of gone from, you know, isolated control systems where I was fat, dumb, and happy and didn't have to worry about anything because it wasn't connected to anything, and I was cool with that. And now all of a sudden we've connected things to other things, and it suddenly dawned on me what that means. What are the potential implications of that? Not all of which are nice, okay? And as I said earlier, the transition, the employment and application of technologies is a never-ending, inexorable march that you cannot stop. So focusing on the two terms here, secure cloud and edge OT. What are the implications of those technologies for that automation engineer out there that's responsible for ensuring the integrity of their operation systems? What do they have to understand? We've heard a couple of things like, you know, Dan mentioned, well, it's just computing somewhere else in the cloud, okay? But, well, what does that mean? What makes my job different or more complicated? Can you get into any of you who want to take that wants to?
Well, I think one thing that we've started to do at Dow is take and move individually isolated plants and start to understand where we can converge computing power across plants and keeping the security layers the same, but just getting economies of scale for that computing, just to ensure that even within a side of a fence line, instead of keeping individually every plant isolated, being able to combine the computing power just to get the economies of scale that we need out of computing.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, in this scenario that you're talking about, right, you know, the risk factor for you could be pretty big if you don't do your due diligence, right? Especially in the cloud, which I'm not just advocating or advocating. but you have to be diligent about that, right? It's somebody else's compute. They are managing a large part of the stack that you have traditionally managed yourself, whether that's patching, whether that's your security measures, whatever. So as you're thinking about that, or if you've just thought of that, maybe that's a little too late. But I would say that only because, when you're going into, like in a traditional on-prem, you use OT environments or ICS environments, the business, if they have things that are relying on the IT, there's a requirements, SLAs, things that they say, here's what our expectations are. We have 5 nines or 3 nines or whatever. If you're not doing that up front with your cloud vendors, then they are going to give you only what they are going to give you, right? So I think that's one thing, just in the general kind of vanilla statements that you made. So, but that's not to say that you can't control that narrative as much as you need to for that particular use case, right? You can tell them that you need 3 nines, 5 nines, whatever that is. You build your architecture to fit into that. But if you're already past that point, then it's kind of, you're kind of just trying to play catch up a little bit on the cloud side. On the edge stuff, I mean, that could all depend on a number of things of, what device was bought, what the design of the device was, what are the compliances around that. But I mean, all those things are, you can mitigate those things. But if you're already at that point of like, it's already in your plant, then that's where you kind of like talk, that's not necessarily the pucker factor you talked about earlier, but you're closer to that than you are further away. So I would just say that if you're already at that point, then you have some catch up to do to start thinking about how do you mitigate that risk.
So to paraphrase, if I could play back, make sure I understood what you said, understand that you're going to strike a balance between, say, connectivity and availability and reliability, those kinds of things.
Oh, yeah.
And know going in, make
Yeah.
informed decisions.
You need to be, I mean, if you're moving something from on-prem to cloud and if it has to be 5 nines, then that's what you need to make sure that you're getting from them, if that's feasible or not. It may not, they may come back and say, best we can do is 3 nines, right? So those are the type of things when you're moving to cloud that you have to be able to do. And what is your risk appetite if you lose connectivity and availability and
What are your contingencies? It's funny you mentioned the nines. Like I said, I live in the Austin area, and if you've been following the news, we just went through this ice storm, and there's a lot of infrastructure down. And the cable provider there, Spectrum, they advertise in their TV ads 99.9% availability. Do the math.
Yeah.
And how many hours that translates to in a year.
Yeah, that's
It's not that impressive.
Right.
And when I worked in the chemical industry, our control system design point was not even 5 nines. It was 99.99975. And do that math, it comes down to like minutes per year.
Yeah.
And so it's something to really think about. Kenny, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so the spectrum of this topic area, I'll focus on IIoT specifically for just a second. And the attractiveness of, and I think if you've been involved in IIoT transformative projects in your environment, I'm sure this will ring true. The attractiveness is in the scalability, the speed of deployment, and the price, really. And so what you see is the operations, the business side, their eyes light up. You mean for literally a couple of orders of magnitude less cost, I can get visibility to process variables, to data, to what have you, that I couldn't otherwise do in maybe 3 weeks, as opposed to a year or 2 that it would often take to deploy that kind of visibility in a traditional DCS, SCADA, ICS type environment. And I get it. That's enormously attractive. What happens, though, is that given long enough, any one-way exchange of data will eventually become a closed-loop control. Given enough time, and time is the metric by which we determine reliability or trustworthiness or integrity, whichever word you want to use, of data. So in other words, I'm getting this data that it cost me much less to get, I could get very quickly, and I'm getting it consistently for a long enough period of time that I can now say, well, I rely on that data. Well, most of the time, folks don't realize that they've now promoted it. They've turned it into something that is a process variable when it really maybe wasn't before. And as soon as that promotion happens, and it's often very nuanced and very subtle, it suddenly becomes a candidate for legitimate process control. And that's a transition that we have to be aware of, because the cybersecurity stakes just went way up when that happens. If you're not involved at that point, boy, do you have to do a lot of backtracking to get back there. So that would be my warning, I guess, cautionary tale, is make sure that the cybersecurity folks are involved in those conversations, that they understand the data use cases, that pipeline of data, once it transitions to something that you're relying upon to make even just optimization and process change and configuration changes and those sorts of things, that you are playing a new ballgame at that point.
Yeah, because so often the person who advocates for the connectivity, the access to the information, is not the person down the road that starts
Correct.
making the use of it.
Yep.
And the person that makes the use of it doesn't understand the trade-offs that were made to get that connectivity. And they're putting more trust in that than is warranted by the design.
And I want to be clear, it isn't if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile.
No.
That's not at all what I'm saying. There's perfectly legitimate reasons for having that technology in that environment. We just have to be there to take those absolute best intentions and be the stewards of security as those things transition into a more mature state.
I'll tell you a little story, very simple pedestrian story. 6 months ago, I got the circulation pump replaced on my pool in the backyard, and they put in a very variable speed pump with a controller mounted on the side of the house, and it's got a Wi-Fi connection. And I have a phone app, right, that I can go in and check what schedule is running and adjust and all. But if that makes 99% availability, I'd be surprised, because it's Wi-Fi and it's outside the house, and maybe it loses a signal and you got to go out and reset it. So yeah, I mean, it's only a pool, but I certainly wouldn't be wanting to actually control anything with that, because about the time, Murphy's Law says the time you need it, it's not going to be there.
So we have one
Yeah,
question.
question?
And while we're getting you, Mike, I was just going to say that, so on the availability, right, if you look at hyperscalers, and they're all going to go down. They've all gone down. We've all seen it. And even for our IT systems, that causes a major impact. And so there has to be a lot of architecture that goes into place as we look at the clouds or the hyperscalers that we're going into on so Dow's a very Microsoft-centric shop of understanding regions, and if you get down to it, you can figure out which racks reboot at different times, and understanding your very specific job placement so that you can get into those higher levels of availability. But when you have an engineer that just grabs a pro card and runs out to a hyperscaler and starts putting stuff in the cloud, you don't get that detailed level of high availability with the hyperscalers.
Yeah, question?
Yeah, I think you started to answer my question a little bit. My question was about how does cybersecurity from the cloud perspective impact process availability, actual plant operations? And I think you hit it a little bit. If you start to rely on that data to, say, run a maintenance schedule or something like that, then you're starting to impact. Is there any other ways that data that we store in a cloud, besides like an IP perspective or secure I don't know, like credit card numbers and all that stuff, right? But any other way that it would impact a industrial operation?
At the chance of seeming controversial, you can misuse anything. I guess I'll start there, right? It is possible to misunderstand the characterized criticality of data. And I mentioned in the previous session I was in this morning that just because you classified data as not particularly sensitive does not mean that it's not particularly important. And it may have relationship or dependency combinations with other data that turns into something else, that turns into something, there's a data workflow, right? Data becomes information, becomes knowledge, becomes wisdom, becomes strategy, And if you purely classify data down at the low end of that spectrum, you're not necessarily understanding what it means when it's combined with other data. It becomes contextual and becomes knowledge and wisdom, right? And so, yes, obviously those things are things we have to watch out for. And then in particular, and I'll stop my little diatribe, I've put a lot of thought into a lot of this. And in particular, what you really want to watch out for is anything that you can immediately draw a line between that data and operational decision making. Okay, and I've heard the argument across the industry. This isn't a specifically Chevron thing, in that, well, we just use that data to inform ourselves before we make a decision, but we have all kinds of other process variables and workflows and what have you that are, yeah, but you're using that data to make a decision, even though it's not in your operational environment. You're a human being, you've seen it, and now you're going over here in the operational environment. It's influenced that environment even if it never crossed the boundary. And you really have to be watching out for those types of situations.
Yeah, I'll agree, and I'll add a little bit more is the data classification, right? When you're putting stuff in the cloud, no matter if it's OT or IT, that data classification is important, right? Where you're storing data, where your VMs are. You don't want to, obviously, you want to make sure from a policy perspective and from a general cyber hygiene perspective, you're segregating and segmenting those away from each other, right? And you're putting the appropriate controls on them. But I'll also say is just on the positive of as far as what you can do in the cloud and spin up things quicker, right? Like we do things with seismic data with our high performance computing stuff. As you that grows in dependency on that, which is doing things wherever you do them at, right? The fact that it can take us hours to less than days to spin that up is kind of the value in that, right? But that's not directly into a closed loop, but that's what helps us drive value into those environments, right? So that's, to me, that's the distinction as we are today, right? Those are the use cases and others that are kind of parallel to that, where cloud gets you that scale and that ability to deploy at a quick pace, right? And obviously you want to have the right cyber guardrails in there, right? You don't want to just put all your data sets in there from all aspects of your enterprise or your OT together, right? So I think those are the things you have to treat cloud just like you treat your on-prem equipment in your on-prem facilities, right? You have to put the right controls, the right data classification, the right security parameters. All of that doesn't go away just because you move it up to somebody else's compute, right? So that's the kind of the add-on that I would add to that kind of that statement. I think Don had a question too.
Don Bartusiak with Collaborative Systems Integration. So Kenny, I want to come back to your point, that your thesis about, all data start as monitoring only, eventually find their way into control applications. I completely agree with that thesis. I think the challenge for us doing it, though, is not to create exclusive solutions for data that are of monitoring purposes, exclusive from data that are for control purposes or high criticality. I think the challenge for us is to architect systems, networks, computing, so that data can be re-provisioned easily when to meet the criticality requirements of the data. So I challenge us to think in those terms rather than building exclusive and parallel data paths in these systems, because I think we're painting ourselves into corners.
I would add to that, Don, that I think that's right. I think, but getting back to how we identify that data is critical too. When it moves from being monitoring to closed loop control or what we're doing, or vice versa, we need to make sure that we understand what that data is and it's appropriately classified. So I think that's kind of the secret sauce of how you kind of architect that stuff, but also classify that stuff as well. Because you can have the right architecture, but if you don't understand what that data is from the who's processing it or who's visualizing it, then that architecture just may go out the window, because you may be kind of mixing and matching data sets across the kind of the different boundaries. So I think that's also the other point there, I would say.
Yeah, it's like amalgamated trust. So if I have data from what I would call a trusted source and data from what I would maybe not so trusted source, and I put them together, well, what is the trust of the result? And well, I mean, a lot of us have engineering or science education backgrounds, and it was the significant digits problem. You're limited by the least number of significant digits you have in any given equation. Well, trust is the same thing. And I agree. I mean, if I put my I can see the future specs on for just a second, which may not be that accurate, but it's the future, so we can speculate. You're looking at hyper-converged infrastructure. You're looking at the traditional sort of wedding cake architectures meltdown. You're looking at virtualization and logical separation rather than physical, and like a lot of these paradigms are going to shift whether we like it or not. And I can either change or hope I retire before it really takes hold, which is probably not going to happen. So yes, we do need to start thinking differently. I would argue that, and this is a big statement that we need many more conference hours to talk about, so we can't go down the path. But you need to be able to say, well, if I'm going to include data in some sort of trust amalgamation, I've got to be able to say, well, what have I done to validate that that data is coming from a trusted source? Cyber will be a large part of that equation, right? In so much as, well, do I trust logical methods? Do I trust virtualization methods? Do we have the containers and the real-time OSs and the ability to do zones and conduits in the box, and et cetera, et cetera? That's coming, but we're just at the beginning of that journey right now.
Would you agree that, if I could just, while you're moving the mic, just interject something here, that we talk about, use the word architecture a lot, and architect and architectures. The other element of this is that the people who are making determinations about what data to use and avail themselves of in order to make decisions and perhaps even build into their control strategies, there's a responsibility incumbent upon them to understand the provenance of that data. Mm-hmm. And the word trust is what got me on this path. How much do I know about not just trust, but availability and all of the rest of that? Because if you make false assumptions, then you're placing an onus on that data source that it's not, to use the word architected, to deliver. And I've seen this happen so many times, where people just assume that all data is created equal. If it's accessible, therefore it's always going to be there. And not necessarily the case.
Well, I was going to say is the fidelity of data, right? So, we get in this trap of moving data around, and how do we deconstruct it or decompose it, move it around, and it's never as good as the original that we started with, right? And so we have to be careful about how we move data around and how many actual places it's in transition, how many places it's in rest, how many times we may, change it from one protocol to another protocol. All those things have to come into that kind of that trust equation and say, what is it from when it was born to now, right? And so you have to be able to connect that and make sure from that architecture perspective and from that engineering person who's got the actual sovereignty of that those things are married together and that you're not breaking that kind of data quality.
So at least one of you has the formal title architect, but if we broaden that a little bit to say designer, architect, whatever that role is, in your view, in your situations, in your respective companies, do you feel that you're adequately consulted by people that are, I'll use the Texas vernacular since I'm now a Texan, transplanted pseudo-Texan, that somebody who's fixing to do something knows that the data, what they can trust that data for and what they can't trust. Do they actually approach you with that? Or do you find out about it typically after the fact?
They do now.
Okay.
I would say going through digital transformation and security transformation that we have over the last few years has made that much more reliable
Good.
process now. Prior to that, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
I'd probably say the same thing. I think as the maturity curve has gone up, that conversation starts a lot earlier than, say, it used to. I'd say that in the past, you had many different streams of data running through the process control environment, the control system environment, in more kind of sparser kind of manners. And so now there's a consolidation of that kind of process, and with the overall kind of digitization, if you will. I think that's a much more earlier conversation.
I'd like to make an aside real quick, just before I forget about it, because I think it's important. So if you look at the long, glorious history of OT cybersecurity, back before it was even called that, There were kind of two main security capabilities that everyone had. That was air gapping and security by obscurity, right? And it was great. Nobody could get to it, and even if they could, how would they understand it? Well, that ship has sailed a long time ago. But when we're talking about things like cloud and IIoT and those sorts of things, take a step back and think about what kind of attacker would be so good that they could modify your data such that they could drive one of those consequences or impacts that we were talking about that are unique in that OT space. That is a nuanced, complex, extremely intelligent attacker that we can actually agree that exists. But a lot of folks in operations have just gotten over the fact that maybe a firewall is not enough. And we're talking about these data scientist career attackers that we know exist, and that's still just a step too far for a lot of folks in the operations world. So that's a big part of the work we have to do to drive home the possible consequences and impacts of compromises in this environment in the IoT cloud edge space that just doesn't make a lot of sense to a layperson. We're dealing with a whole new generation. If we're doing digitalization 5.0 or whatever the new name for it is, the attackers are on 6.0. So I think we had a question.
Another question from the
So
audience?
yeah, I was kind of reading between the lines. I want to kind of throw something back for a little more discovery. I picked up a couple of key words, and that you should treat the cloud application just like you treat your enterprise, even though you may not be the one architecting it. So to me, that implies, and I heard a few little things that says, if I'm going to go out for a cloud-based service, then I need to produce a cybersecurity requirement spec. Now, that spec may not be as detailed as if I were building out the enterprise, but at a minimum, I need to make sure that that provider understands what the availability, what the integrity, and what the confidentiality requirements are for the data and the services they're going to provide, so I have something to pass on to the next generation, so that when it does get decided, well, what was the basis and what did we tell the provider he's responsible for? Can I use it to the level that I'm now wanting to use it? Have y'all taken that practice to that level when selecting these OT services or softwares or because this is something new. It's kind of like a light bulb came on. Wait a minute. We're going out and we're hiring these services or, it's as a service, but I haven't seen too many actual formal, even, simple executive cybersecurity requirements that's actually being developed as part of those requirements. A lot of time it's, yeah, hey, we want your service. Yeah, it sounds good. We're going to take it.
I would say that we've rolled that into our overall vendor risk management. As we look at each vendor we look to onboard, whether they're a cloud provider, a SaaS provider, or whatever, we're doing that due diligence, and I would say everyone should be, of going in and looking at what their cyber hygiene looks like, both asking them what their internal looks like, as well as looking at what their external looks like. One of the other functions that I deal with in our organization is I deal with our external attack surface management suite of tools. So I know what we look like externally, and I can tell you that there's a new vendor popping up every day that will give me a scorecard on what my external attack surface looks like. They all have access to the same set of data. And so if we're looking at a vendor that we're going to move at and they externally look cruddy, there's no way we're going to trust them with data more than my email address to start the conversation.
But have you taken it to the level of specifying those levels of requirements? Like you talked about nines earlier, but and I think about, are we actually documenting this so that both they know and we know in the future?
So as part of supply chain management, yes, we have. I mean, is there more to the journey? Sure. But yes, we've definitely started going down that road. I'll state another thesis, because apparently that's my thing today, is that any proof of concept left in place long enough becomes a deployed solution. And there were proofs of concept that were established before we went through our transformation process that we have now had to go back and do that work on. That's been successfully completed. And so there was, I won't call it cleanup, but let's go back and reevaluate the relationship with third-party vendors and those sorts of things to ensure that we're solving those problems. And in the lessons learned there, we developed the new process by which we do it inherently.
I have a question, oh, over here first.
Phone already. I have within our plants, we have about 1,000 or so in the world. We do see that people see ads as I see they talk about ads as field ads in the PLC rack or in the machine, or ads as an outpost, which is for me a pure server, right? Do you and your companies have a sort of distinction between ads close to the control, almost doing core control, right? And ads which is more for the crystal balls, toys, the fluffy stuff?
So we've got most of our edge, I would say, is it depends, right? We have multiple business lines in ExxonMobil. We have Uncon that is a totally different business line than, say, our chemical and refining plants. And so in our Uncon space, they've deployed a lot of edge that's close to the PLC and is connected to the PLC and is pulling tags off of those PLCs and doing algorithms on there and sending that metadata up, right? And that's pretty close, right? Because in Uncon, the PLC is primarily the control block inside of those areas. It's not a plant facility or something like that. It's multiple tank battery fields, wells, things like that. We've done similar things, but not quite to the level in some of our major plants, and we're still working that, right? And so we're trying to get the fit for purpose, fit for risk kind of use cases where we're going to get data, stranded data that is valuable to that facility and be able to use it for that particular use case. So I'd say we've got a spectrum of use cases that we're using for edge, and they're not all particularly the exact same use case because of just the size of the company, right? But it's different. Different companies use it for different things. No. No. Yeah, the only thing that I'd say that we have that's so in our lubes environment, we have some stuff that we'd use that for, but that's in our I'm having a brain dump right now. What's in our dang it. On our in some of our storage facilities that we have for our lubes locations. I'm forgetting the name right, but yeah, thank you. Warehouse, thank you, Michael. We're doing some things where they're doing this barcode scanning and things like that, but it's not doing actual control.
There was another question here.
You mentioned that there's certain vendors that you wouldn't even approach because you have the resources to understand what their security levels are. You guys, Chevron, Dow, Exxon, right? Pretty large companies. How would you recommend a smaller company who's, not nearly that size, we don't have that much exposure? How do we evaluate what's appropriate, and how do we protect ourselves when it comes to this?
I would say in a general way, I mean, most of the cloud providers provide their SOC 3 compliance online, so you at least get a peer into what they have and what their security compliance is from a SOC 3 perspective. And you can always, if you are really interested, you can ask them for a SOC 2 Type 2 report. And they generally, if you sign an NDA, will allow you to do that. So that's kind of the way that you can kind of at least get a feel for those without, naming any particular one. But that's a very generic way of kind of getting a sense of what those cloud providers, how they are, from an independent auditor, how they are seen.
Yeah, that's definitely the first bullet point I probably would have said too. The other few are, so a little picture real quick for the ISA Secure Compliance Institute has now, as of the end of last year, a certification for IIoT vendors. It's not all the way to the cloud and everything else, but it's part of the equation. So start looking for certifications to pop up. That'll be another helpful way. Another is, honestly, we should all be collaborating a lot more. I mean, the simple fact is this is 1 hour of the year. There could be many more hours like this where we can sit down and just compare notes, right? There's a lot of lessons we've learned that we're more than happy to pass on to make critical infrastructure more secure, right? And then last but not least, start defining, and this is the same road we all went down, I think, but start defining what acceptable architectures and use cases are right now before you even think about engaging vendors that you want to rate the trustworthiness or, what have you. Decide what you want first, because if you don't, I guarantee you, generally speaking, vendors will help you define what you want in a way that maybe makes more sense for the vendor than you. And that's fine, it's partnership, but you really need to come to the table understanding the use case you're trying to solve.
So with that, there's any number of additional, like I said, there's SaaS providers popping up all the time now that will do the external attack surface management recon for you and provide you that detailed external view report if you don't want to do the reviewing yourself. Right? So you can go out and grab one of these guys and say, I want to start shipping with FedEx. Tell me what FedEx's thing is. My brother-in-law just joined a new law firm. And he told me when he was switching law firms, first thing I did is pulled up his new law firm's security report, and I gave him a list of 12 things. I said, you should have these resolved before you sign your contract to become a partner. So.
Yeah, and I would say just from a general standards perspective, just to, NIST from their cloud standards and also the Cloud Security Alliance, those are good sources to kind of give you kind of an understanding of what good should look like, right? So then you can look at that SOC 3, and then when you go to that SOC 2 Type 2 from an NDA, you have a good perspective of what you're trying to look for.
Yeah,
We have, okay, back in the back of the room.
Yeah, I'd like to poke a little bit about the mental model that cloud is just another compute platform. If you think about the paradigm shift in your risk profile, just as an example, if I have a misconfiguration in the cloud and I expose an S3 bucket if you're AWS or a compute platform, the risk is exponentially higher than if I make that same mistake on premise behind an OT firewall. So your profiles are very different, and I think, Kenny, you touched on a little bit on how much I need to know about you as a company and your security models and all the rest of that versus if you're just AWS or Microsoft or whoever. The other thing I think you might miss if you use that model is the advantages of auto-scaling, as an example. Scale your resources up or down based on demand, or things like CI/CD pipelines to help automate your move to production, get humans out of the middle of it and reduce your exposure to be able to analyze that pipeline for security risk, things like that. And also the ability to do systems that are secure by design and self-securing. So I think those are also things to consider when you're moving to cloud. Just one quick comment on the availability. You can pick your availability, at least in my experience from your cloud providers, pretty simply. Again, use AWS, their availability zones, their regions, all the rest of that. Where you're probably going to have more difficulty with your reliability is in your network connections. Do you have diverse and redundant network connections is maybe more of an issue than what the cloud provider has. Anyway, a couple of comments.
Yeah, because the cloud provider is going to give you actual power compute uptime, but a simple fiber cut outside your fence line is going to take you offline for days. So.
Yeah, I know years ago when I was still with Dow, when we did the SAP implementation, the first one, way back, that tells you how long ago it was. I was, at the time, was in charge of site communications at an integrated site. And we were dealing with the phone company for long-distance communications back to headquarters for SAP. And exactly what you just said, we insisted on diverse routing. They said, no, we've got, our network has got this high availability. And yes, well, but we have one line outside of runs out of our fence to your network. So you're gonna run another line from the other side in, okay? And of course, that's digging and running cables and all that. And they didn't want to do that because they said, well, it's, our system is, no, it's not your system that we're worried about. It's our connection to your system.
Yeah, I would-
One backhoe, one traffic accident can take that out.
No, I would agree with you on the site-based availability. That's where you have to make sure your architecture, your circuit scalability, what you put in there, you may have traditionally, because everything was sitting on that facility, you may have only had one or two connections, one being maybe an MPLS and one being internet VPN. Now maybe you have to change that approach. So yeah, that's all in that equation to me from availability and reliability. And you may have only had, n times however many devices from your core up to your edge WAN router or your point of presence, right? So all that has to come into that equation now that you're moving where that compute and storage and all that is now taking place.
And I think the other thing too, we've talked about availability and reliability, which are aspects of performance, but the other aspect of performance is mean time to recover. Because Murphy's Law says if it can happen, it's going to happen. And so, and I'm thinking it's foremost in my mind because many of my neighbors back in Texas right now are going into their 5th day without power. Because it's not that the failure happened, it's how long does it take to recover from the failure?
I'll tell you what I find heartening is that we just had a 5-minute conversation about DevOps at an OT cybersecurity conference. That wasn't a thing not very long ago, right? And so when we talk about the convergence, remember that was the buzzword of 2018, I think it was, IT/OT convergence. Last year's buzzword was zero trust. This year's ChatGPT. Next year will be hyperconvergence. And, we always have our thing, right? But to use those kinds of concepts in describing how we're approaching OT cybersecurity, I mean, it's pretty groundbreaking, I think. There's a lot available to us, automated, CI/CD pipelines and automate, the technology that can be used in those virtualized cloud type environments that can provide microsegmentation and like that is really, really powerful. And to your point, I think saying it's just the cloud is just somebody else's computer, which I think I have a T-shirt somewhere that says that. It's dismissive to say that's the end of that conversation. There's clearly so much power to bring to bear on this problem, and we are going to have to deal with it very shortly.
Do we have another question somewhere? Who's got the mic? Mike, who's got the mic? Somebody have a question?
Front row.
So some of the vulnerability at the edge, Amol Busari from Wood, by the way. So the question is, some of the vulnerability at the edge may be baked into proprietary third-party packaged equipment that just makes its way into a project or so some kind of activity on site. And so how do you create a framework that prevents that from happening? So it's one thing to vet vendors, like you mentioned before, maybe we will have ESG type ratings one day for vendors, but then what do you do with some of these things that can sneak in, make their way into an environment that's...
So to extend my statement I just made, dev, test, prod. That's also new, right? If you are using those environments appropriately, that's where you should be testing for those things.
Yeah, and if you're talking specifically at the vendor point of presence, I think we have to start being a little bit more diligent and more thoughtful when we're talking to our vendors about what we expect out of the specs that they are delivering to us not just from an operational perspective, but from a cyber perspective, right? We shouldn't be just allowing them to put things in there and within a vacuum, right? We shouldn't just let them do stuff just because they've always done stuff right. And so we have to have a thoughtful, more meaningful conversation about those things.
Has anyone seen that commercial that's on TV right now? I've seen it a million times, where the customer is talking to the service provider, and he says, "Now let me understand. You're telling me that this is the only way. This is the way you do things." And the vendor says, "Yeah, this is what we do. As a matter of fact, this is the only thing that we do. And the commercial says, you know, if your vendor tells you that, look for another vendor, right? Because it's, okay, we've got a hammer and we're gonna pound you until you look like a nail. So, yeah. Other questions, comments?
Just curious, from a corporate standpoint, if you guys have policies on open source projects, you know, especially when you start talking edge and, you know, maybe more Linux powered devices, open source is maybe a little more adopted and accepted, especially with, you know, the variety of packages available through, you know, the package managers and how easily they are able to be included in other projects and, you know, things like that. What stance do you take on, you know, commercial versus open source?
I would say for our custom developed code where we're including that, we're using things within our CI/CD pipelines to look for vulnerabilities on every library that's included in it. The hard part is as you look at that development, it's very easy to pull in one library and then pull in 200 vulnerabilities. Log4j, right? So.
Or you
So-
pull in a library that in turn pulls in another library, which pulls, you know.
Yeah, so, you know, the code scanning that will look at every subsequent included library is very powerful in that case. As far as policies, no, it's covered within just our overall internal development frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, we have policies that drive actions that you're speaking of, including SAS and DAS scanning, and I can't believe we've gotten this far into this part of the conversation and not said SBOM at least once. But,
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
but I mean, as far as hard policy saying thou shall or shall not, that's really not it. It's thou shalt do these things if you're thinking about doing that, because it has to be a fully validated, fully tested and scanned and et cetera before we can go down that road.
So we've talked a lot about cloud, but as we as we think about the complementary side, the edge, the bill of materials concept becomes extremely important. And it's not only SBOMs, it's also HBOMs, right? I mean, hardware can have vulnerabilities, and we need to know the provenance of that hardware. I've seen, I'm sure you may have seen too, the articles where they've speculated that, you know, foreign sourced equipment, Huawei, for example, that may have or is purported to have vulnerabilities purposely or not purposely intrinsic in it. And if you attach it to your infrastructure, you take on those vulnerabilities. Yes?
Yeah, we have certain stances on sourced equipment.
Yeah.
And which hardware we will allow to be connected to the enterprise or to a level 3 system, just based on where it's sourced. And hopefully that gets caught in procurement. Sometimes we find it after it's already hanging on a pole somewhere. And then we have to work on other layers of isolation or pull it off and buy new capital. So.
Yes, Michael Hoteling from ExxonMobil. One of the topics that I thought I would be interested in your perspective on is really, we've talked about where, but one of the comments I haven't heard people talk about is data ownership, right? And when we talk about this concept of IoT, you know, whether it's your own cloud or third-party services, interested in your perspective around data ownership in terms of control.
Well, I think we've had multiple conversations on this, Michael, before. So I think you know my perspective, but I'll let everybody hear who may not have been involved in those. So, you know, whether it's edge, IoT, cloud, from the OT environment, my perspective is the business needs to drive what that data is from a classification, from a policy, from what needs to be done from a cybersecurity or for just a general security perspective. So for me, that's the big deal that needs to be answered, and then we get to the and where and how and what we're doing with it, right? Without that, then I'm just making a lot of PowerPoint presentations.
So just out of curiosity, that's a very interesting point. What what responsibilities, acknowledged or unacknowledged, go along with data ownership? Because what I found a lot of times is people argue about or advocate for owning data until they realize the responsibilities that are incumbent with that. And then all of a sudden, they're not so excited about it anymore. Have you encountered any of that kind of scenario?
Well, I think we're all just kind of asking the next part of the question. So
Right.
we'll get to an answer here in a second. But it's all about defining terms. And so there's also the distinction between data ownership and data stewardship,
Yeah.
right? And as we were talking, when it comes to edge compute, when it comes to a large portion of how we use cloud in at least OT environments, I'm going to go back to the beginning and say, you're taking raw data, you're amalgamating that raw data into another product. You're creating something else. Well, at what point did your ownership change when that data became source data for something else? And shared ownership is probably not something you can sustain, right?
Right.
So I think there's a really interesting philosophical conversation you can have within the organization about which parts of the organization own what. I think it becomes a lot more clear when you're talking about third-party solutions. At that point, I think the organization would maintain it owns the data. And ideally, you would be looking for third-party, SaaS or otherwise solutions that actually maintain immutability. The actual doesn't matter who the third party is, and I'm looking for the technical terms, and I can't draw them up right now. But effectively, even they don't have access to the data that they're hosting.
Yeah.
Only you do, right? Encapsulation or whatever you want to
But
call
even,
that.
even within your own organization, I'll take a very trivial example, and this maybe it's a dated example, I don't know, but I suspect it still exists. Process data in a plant, tags, values, that kind of thing. The argument was always, well, that belongs to the plant. They own that, quote unquote, whatever that means. But the reality, to follow on your theme a little bit, is that if that data is then used by someone else and recharacterized, maybe it's not even transformed, but it's recharacterized and put to a use, then that use may be owned by someone else, right? Because the people where the data was sourced didn't necessarily understand where it might eventually be employed.
So you're quickly getting into the realm of systems of record,
Yeah.
and trusted systems, and that you could probably teach entire philosophy classes in engineering school on that alone.
Yeah.
There are several ways to approach that problem. One is to say, outside of that system of record, there is no concept of ownership. It's only its original source that
Right.
owns, right? And whatever you have is not the truth necessarily because it isn't in the system of record. That's one way. Another is you actually have you establish trust relationships with other groups. You inherit a certain, it becomes metadata about the data, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of ways to approach the problem.
Yeah.
I don't know that anyone has completely nailed it down, even in these big organizations.
In your view, does it get muddier, or is it pretty much the same with the proliferation of edge now that this figure over here?
So the way I have tended to approach it, and I advise that folks tend to approach it, is I'm less concerned about who owns the data initially. I'm concerned about who owns the risk.
Yeah,
If this data is compromised, well, who is going to suffer the impact?
That's a
And
good
if
answer.
it's more than one, well, then you share.
yeah.
But-
So it's based on consequence
Yeah.
or potential consequence. Yeah. Other questions over here? This is a good discussion. As you can see, this is a much more involved topic than just security. We're talking about resilience and reliability, and of which security is part of. But yes, go ahead, your question.
So we've talked some about the cloud and the secureness of the data at the cloud. We talked a little bit about the device. A couple of times we've mentioned the pipeline between the two. If I turn on a public modem, less than 5 minutes, I get hacker bots hitting it, bam. I just kind of want to hear from the big guys, what is your kind of corporate enterprise scheme for managing this? Because, there's tons of tricks, TLS, certs. Who manages that? Is that just an add-on to the project? Who's doing it? Who in perpetuity? Because it's just as vulnerable as the other 2 points as the in-between spot, right?
Yeah,
Go ahead. You can
it's
start.
it's a fine line now between what I can say publicly and what I can't, because there is some cybersecurity, in-house, knowledge here. But I would argue that you can belay a lot of that with private networks, right? So put things on the public
Oh, no.
network, and then, Shodan should not be your asset management tool. That's fine.
Can we quote you on that?
So, yes, it has to be encrypted in transit, right? So don't send anything out over even your private fiber if it's not encrypted in transit. Everything is always encrypted. And then, big guys, Dow at least, we take private routes into hyperscalers instead of traversing across the public networks that way even.
Not even get into the details. How are you knowledgeably and actively managing it? We run into a lot of clients who are like, I'm lost here. What do we do? And is this a new position in IT? Is this a new place on the OT side? Who owns it?
At Dow, we take care, it's handled from our IT cyber side, between our IT cyber and our IT networking folks, ensuring that everything that egresses the company is secured, and that then we have secure routes into the hyperscalers we use.
Yeah, we have similar policies of how we traverse and send data to the cloud. I would also add that transit also, cloud equals encryption at rest, where you're putting your keys, what type of encryption you're using, all those things should be a part of that whole entire philosophy of how you're moving data and then resting data.
I mentioned it earlier, but if you're adopting something like the 62443 zones and conduits model, you are now, with a lot of these edge devices, you're literally seeing zones inside the box. And so boundaries inside of hypervisors and real-time operating systems and containerized systems and encapsulated systems and what have you, that's a pretty new concept. It's one I'm pretty excited about. But that does allow you some more flexibility about what parts of the zoned architecture inside that box you're exposing as well, because your boundary protections are built in. Having that available ubiquitously across vendors is still, we have a ways to go before that happens.
That was my next question, is how do you control it? You're talking about vendors and everybody has a cloud solution. How do you enforce it?
Like most big organizations, you play Franken solution for a while, where you're bolting things together and doing integration. I mean, that's a cute way of saying you integrate a lot, right? And then as the partnerships with vendors, the partnerships with industry organizations, those kinds of things will start to drive standardization. That's how it worked in the traditional DCS SCADA world. That's how it's going to work in the IoT world. I mean, everyone's sort of trying to find their way. But I think at the end of the day, what we want to see is fabric type solutions rather than nuts and bolts. We don't want to just be bolting a bunch of things together. I really would like to buy more comprehensive solutions that integrate with cloud security and asset management capabilities, that integrate with credentials management capabilities, that have containerization and real-time operating systems and all the things, so that I really don't care anymore. It's kind of an open architecture system. That's a little over the horizon, but.
Let me give you a use case and ask you if you've encountered this or not. Picture, I'm doing my best to channel Rod Serling here. Picture, if you will, an integrated chemical complex. Could be a petroleum complex too, but I'll use chemicals. And there's a lot of interconnection at level 0 and 1, or 1 and 2, not 0 and 1. 1 and 2 of the 62443 reference model. And then because of company changes, facilities with that in that integrated complex now are owned by different business entities.
Mm-hmm.
But they're interconnected for metering or whatever. To what extent does that cause angst among people? And do you see where have you seen situations where those kind of scenarios are pushed to go to, I call it the up and over, instead of from here to here, you go up and through the corporate and then back down to the other company. Have you seen cases where people have argued to basically re-engineer that because we can't close couple them anymore because they're not us anymore?
So I'll make a slight correction to one statement that was made there. That whole idea of level 0, 1, and 2, and that's Purdue, that's not 62443.
Well,
62443 doesn't care.
I referenced the 62443 reference model.
But
I mean, I authored the document, so, but yeah, okay.
But it is pertinent to my
Yeah,
answer, because if we're thinking in terms of zones, conduits, and how they interact with one another, all you really have to do is ensure that you're in line with those prerequisites, I guess, for lack of a better word, those security requirements. I don't have a specific example. I can absolutely figure a speculative example or a hypothetical. For example, API 1164, if you've read through that, they have adopted a NIST CSF 6443 kind of merged thing.
yeah.
And I like one thing they did was they said, okay, zones and conduits, you got zones, you got conduits, great. Why don't we define layers and call it external, intermediate, and internal? And so at least conceptually, you can still treat things a certain way based on what types of zones they are and what they represent as a relationship between entities. And in that case, you could pretty easily tilt, the usual top to bottom stack sideways.
Right.
And go, well, okay, I have this entity over here that's not us anymore. It is inherently, therefore, external. And because I have rules about what I have to have between them, I inherently have to have an intermediate network, and therefore, I've already laid out that architecture. I just implement it. I don't know.
I use that use case because that's an example of where the people that make the decision say to, and I'll use a Dow example, the people that make the decision to divest the chlorine business in Freeport, Texas, and sell it to a different company, but the plants don't go anywhere. They're still in the same fence line,
Yep.
all right? They don't think twice about what the implications are that that asset is now owned by a different corporate entity. So the question, I guess, is, have you seen situations where the, quote, architects are sort of called upon after the fact to go, how do we, what, if anything, do we have to do about this?
And I think I've seen some real world situations where we've, for lack of a better term, divested or sold stuff, but we still have assets or
Yeah.
tank batteries or tanks.
Yeah.
And so you have to treat them to the point as external now, but you still have to have some kind of visibility or some kind of accountability in cyber around that. So yes, I mean, I think that's where you have to, that's that trust versus untrusted, or what's the risk between the two, and you have to adjust and you have to accommodate for that.
And so it calls upon the designers / architects to have a finger in the wind to know what's going on and to bring the implications of those decisions forward as soon as possible after the decision made, because it's not going to be before the decision made. I used to have people work for me say, well, before they made that divestiture decision, why didn't they consult with us about the infrastructure implications? And it's like, really? No, they're not going to do that. Question?
Hi. I'm not sure if that is really a question. My name is Matthias. We are a small tech company from Germany. We have developed an industry IoT platform to control drones, driving robots and swimming robots, so everything autonomously. And we just received the 62443 cybersecurity certificate. So it took us 3.5 years to program all that stuff, and even 3,000 pages to write down the documentation for the certification. So I'm wondering, is it more like a task for the vendor who sells the equipment to you guys to make sure it's 62443, or is it you guys taking care of it? How do you manage, and how many troops do you need to get all that done for your installations?
I mean, I would say there's a lot of layers to that, right? Like there's just what's the warranty, maintenance. If you don't adhere to that spec and you're asking us to do that and we have to make some changes to it, what does that do between that maintenance, warranty, and reliability, right? That you'll say it's not working anymore, right? If we come to you and say it's not working anymore because we made these changes, right? So I'm a firm believer in, if there's a industry spec that we want the vendors to be to, that they can build something too, in this case, for those drones and for those swimming robots. And so I would rather have the vendor do it than me trying to do that in an ad hoc fashion. That's just, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to that, but those are 2 or 3 big bullet points for me that come up when you're talking about those standards, right?
Yeah, I mean, if I understood the question correctly, it was, do asset owners want vendors to have achieved certification externally, or do we want to somehow issue?
Oh,
well,
okay.
We're not in
Yeah,
the
okay.
certification issuing
Yeah,
business,
yeah.
so no. I mean, that's not up to us.
So still the same answer.
Yeah, there is procurement rigor that in the absence of certifications will, be deployed, but that nevertheless, we're not issuing certifications. That's certainly not true. The benefits of certification, obviously, is that you have a published, widely agreed upon set of requirements and standards. You have an unbiased testing environment where neither of us is involved in making the decision about certification. There's all those kinds of benefits, but yeah, it's not an internal thing.
I got a question. Do you think that IEC 62443 has an impact on the insurance like 61508, for example, that it's going to be a insurance requirement?
Way out of my wheelhouse. I have no idea.
No view on that or any discussions?
I mean, I'm not involved in those discussions, so.
Are you meaning from a cybersecurity insurance perspective?
Yeah. Same thing. If you put safety in the plan, correct? If you talk about cell safety, you need to have certain levels in order to get your insurance coverage. Yeah.
Oh no, he's
after a safety assessment. I can imagine that an insurance company who wants to insure your liabilities of, environmental whatever, actually comes back and said, I want to make sure that you meet certain cybersecurity standards in order to secure you, insure you. Any discussions on that? Is there any viewpoint of anybody knows if that is potentially on the books? Because we have seen it in other areas.
The short answer is yes. They're already using just the simple of external attack surface management scoring to clarify what you'll pay for your cyber insurance.
I can tell you
So-
that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope.
I can tell you from my personal experience over the last several years through my work in ISA, my volunteer work in ISA, I've been involved in many conversations with some very large insurance companies. And as the more they learn, the more they question the wisdom of even writing policy for cybersecurity as to whether or not if it's a viable business proposition. So they are trying to, I'm talking about big insurance companies trying to understand, is this really what we want to insure? It's like writing a policy against hurricane damage for South Florida. I mean, it's,
They use the term unquantifiable risk.
Yeah.
Because insurers are used to quantifying risk, and we don't have an office around cybersecurity.
Now, the conversation has gone on and continues to go on, but I don't think it's reached fruition yet. But I can almost guarantee that conformance testing and certification is going to be part of that.
Yeah, and if the underlying subtext of the question was, do at least I feel that personally 62443 is of sufficient quality and breadth and depth and what have you to be used to do conform? Yes, I do. I agree. I think that it would be. But the actual conversation about what insurance companies will do on any given day. I mean, insurance as a concept, not just cybersecurity insurance, but insurance as a concept is largely predicated on the idea that you have historical data and actuarial data to base your not gambling, but your financial risk on, right? And cyber has always been this outlier because it is truly, I think, a gamble because you don't have actuarial
Pretty hard to
tables,
predict, unlike safety, yeah. I think the other factor to consider in this, when you're talking about very, very large companies, of which similar to what are represented on this panel, and that I used to work for, to a very large extent, those companies are self-insured. And so they may have some insurance for maybe their IT assets and so forth, but when it comes to their manufacturing assets, they're self-insured. And so that changes things quite a bit. Other questions, comments, anything else we should explore? We have some time left. We've got about, I think, about a half an hour if we need it. So, but then we can always leave early.
I just have a comment going back to when we were talking about communication reliability. So I'm from Alberta, Canada. I work at an industrial site there. Most of our IT servers are at a data center owned by an internet provider, probably a half hour, 45-minute drive from the site. Last year, this internet provider, which is also a cell phone company, had a nationwide outage for, I don't know, a day or two or three. So our company had people working in offices on site had no access to network drives or asset management systems or things like that. Control systems worked fine. They were fully on site. Incidentally, this company, Rogers, doesn't provide home internet access in Alberta, so people working from home still had access to the network drives and stuff. But I thought I heard someone from IT saying our company is considering actually signing up with 2 internet providers in case this happens again. But yeah, that's what we've encountered with internet connection reliability.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, golden rule, don't have a single point of failure, right? So, and depending on the facility or depending on the location, right? What you consider to be high availability, right? What do you consider to be resilient? So, and I'm familiar with Alberta. We have an office up there too, and I'm familiar with Rogers too. I would say that probably, if possible, I would have had a backup or some other provider. But I mean, I think there's an answer. It's what is high availability to you, and what does it mean to you, right? And what is the impact to that particular facility or enterprise to you? So I would say that I would never have any kind of critical or high priority location being relying on one provider, even if I had 20 circuits, right? So diversity of providers and diversity of path is always something that I would look for if possible. Right? There's parts of Canada where that's not possible, right?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Canada. As I mentioned in my introduction, I used to work for Dow, and both in Canada and the U.S. And I don't know what it's like now. It's probably much different now. But back in those days, traversing the border between Canada and the U.S., there was like the number of points where you crossed the border for telecommunications you could count on the fingers of one hand. So it was more than one, but it wasn't a huge number. So all of these connections would converge and go over from Blaine, Washington to British Columbia, or from Windsor, Ontario to Detroit. It was like 3 or 4 of them across the entire country. So I think today the technology is a little different, obviously, but back then those are the kinds of things you had to worry about. Those are the kind of sins that there's no sin in making that mistake once. The sin is in making it twice. Mm-hmm. After you've been bitten and don't do something about it, that's when you get that's the sin. Anything else? I have no problems letting you go soon, earlier. If there are no other questions, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your interest. This has been a great discussion.